episode, and I've invited a very good friend of mine to speak on a thinker who's kind of both haunted in a positive way and a negative way in the history of German philosophy. So the great event with pantheism between Lessing and Jacobi, and also letters from Schelling to Hegel, with Schelling saying, I have a new teacher, that teacher is Spinoza. So today I've invited Mary Peterson to navigate us through Spinoza's philosophy. So, Mary Peterson is a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Hamburg. Her dissertation is titled The Metaphysics of Will in Hobbes and Spinoza, and earlier this year, Mary was a visiting researcher in the philosophy department at Yale. She has an article forthcoming on Spinoza's freedom and Clarice's Lispector's novel, Near to the Wild Heart. Mary also does public-facing work on sexual misconduct in academia. So welcome, Mary, to the Young Idealist.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yes, and I know Mary because Mary's quite active on philosophy Twitter, and so am I. So we've been talking for a couple months, and I heard Mary speak on another podcast, and I thought she sounded absolutely articulate and wonderful and energetic, and I thought she'd be perfect for this. So my first question for you is, since this channel is devoted to thinkers of classical German philosophy and German idealism, I thought it would be very interesting to have an episode on Spinoza, since he's such a pivotal figure in debates between Jacobi, Mendelssohn, Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling. And it seems that Spinoza is a really important interlocutor. So I was wondering if you could perhaps explain why Baruch Spinoza, and why do you think his philosophy matters in our contemporary time today?
Yeah, well, Baruch Spinoza, Baruch being his Hebrew name, Benedictus is his Latin name, Bento is his Portuguese name, was a 17th century Dutch philosopher. He was a Descartes scholar and proponent of a philosophy often characterized today as substance monism. So Spinoza thought that there is only one substance, God, the cause of all that is. Spinoza is usually taught today in undergraduate history of philosophy courses as an early modern rationalist alongside Leibniz and Descartes. Of course, the story is much more interesting than that, as we'll see, hopefully. So I think Spinoza's philosophy matters today because it's excellent. I think the system is elegant. I think it's endlessly fascinating. There's a beautiful balance in Spinoza between unity and simplicity on the other. Also, Anglophone scholarship on Spinoza is, I think, in a golden age. And so there's been an outcropping of new books and articles on Spinoza really since 2000. Now, I was reading Margaret Golan-Wer's biography of Spinoza from 1998 earlier this week. And she was saying in 1998 that the last 30 years had been a golden age of Spinoza scholarship in the Anglophone world. So perhaps I'm too much a product of my time, but I think it is safe to say that the tides have turned and there is a lot of sort of positive sentiment about. I should qualify my statement that we're in a golden age of Anglophone Spinoza scholarship, because we've heard this before. Margaret Golan-Wer says in her 1998 biography of Spinoza that the last 30 years had been a very exciting time in Anglophone scholarship. So hopefully there's just sort of more and more good work on Spinoza coming out. Spinoza's books were banned for many years, starting right after he died. So the Index of Forbidden Books in the Catholic Church already banned Spinoza's work in 1679, 2 years after he died. And that whole index was only overturned in 1966. There were many years when Spinoza's works were out of circulation or only being circulated sort of underground, which is, I think, led to a lot of really exciting, but has also meant that his work hasn't taken its place in the canon until later than I think it should. In terms of tying Spinoza to contemporary issues, I think there are a few kind of common approaches to doing that I'll discuss. And then I'll kind of give my passing opinion about these approaches. So one approach to bringing Spinoza into the contemporary is seeing him as a naturalist who's useful to ecofeminism or eco-philosophy, because he asserts Deus sive natura, God or nature, as being in some sense identical. There's a feeling that he imbues nature with a kind of value. Now, we should be troubled by this, I think, right? Because Spinoza, at the end of the appendum, a hierarchy of value in nature that would, allow us to protect, for example, forests as more valuable than airplanes or plastic or these things that we see as polluters. But nevertheless, I think that there's the feeling that Spinoza supplies us with the tools to protect nature and also to raise its stature in some way. It's an interesting question, I think, right? If a polluted world for Spinoza is one that's choked in its striving, right? So he thinks that all things by their essence strive for their self-preservation. So it's interesting to wonder, well, if the world is sort of polluted and sick, right? Is this bad for Spinoza because it challenges the world's striving? Well, that's one approach. I think another approach is arguing that Spinoza articulates a form of radical monism. So comparing Spinoza's alleged monism that I mentioned above to kind of contemporary monism, inserting him into this debate in contemporary metaphysics. Now, is this a contemporary issue in the world? It's an issue in philosophy, but it's a way to make him kind of useful for a contemporary debate. Monism, just briefly, is the metaphysical thesis that only one concrete thing exists. That would be existence monism. Or that there's only one fundamental category under which everything falls. That would be substance monism. The most kind of radical Parmenidean interpretation that's come out recently is that Spinoza's monism goes so far as to undermine the existence of finite things altogether. It's also worth saying that monism was first introduced into philosophical parlance in the 18th century by Wolff, so in 1728, which was after Spinoza's death in 1677. So Spinoza was not calling himself a monist, and we do need to argue that he was, right? This requires an argument to say that he's a monist.
Well, I have to thank you for that really very rich answer. I think you did a really good job of explaining several important issues of why Spinoza is both important as a contemporary thinker in our age and also as a metaphysical thinker for philosophy. So I want to thank you for that as well. I really liked the point about Wolff as well too, because I have an episode on Wolff as well too, and I like the bringing Spinoza's context back. Now, because this series is about introducing the thinker to those that are new to Spinoza, but also, to people that are also well-read with Spinoza, I was wondering if you could maybe briefly give a small biography on Spinoza's life, maybe outlining the important events. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. It can be just some of the main points, so we can get a feel of who this wonderful thinker is.
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's really some excellent biographical work on Spinoza from Stephen Nadler, from Jonathan Israel, from Margaret Goldenworth, I mentioned. So it's a great question. Spinoza was born on November 24th in 1632 in Amsterdam to Iberian parents, so parents from the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal. His family was Jewish. They had been forced to hide their Jewish identity in Portugal and ultimately flee to the Netherlands. So religious persecution is an important, I think, part of Spinoza's family history. His father was a merchant, a raisin merchant, dried fruits. And unfortunately, he had accrued a lot of debt. So Spinoza was sort of left with this failing business and forced to try to save it. And he wasn't successful. So the family business collapsed. And during that time, Spinoza started to have some discord with the Jewish authorities in his community. Part of this was that he when he was settling his father's estate, he ignored the Jewish authority, Jewish law on the settlement of it, and appealed to Dutch law instead. This kind of coincided with, I think, Spinoza's growing interest in philosophy and interest in ideas that would have left him at odds with his community either way. But he was expelled from his community when he was 23 as a very young man. And great violence happened. And also, I think it's worth noting that Spinoza didn't try to appeal the decision at any point in his life, which he could have. So he parted ways with his community, and shortly after that, he moved in with Franciscus van den Enden, who was a pedagogue, his Latin teacher, also introduced Spinoza to the arts, to theater, to philosophy, and to empirical science. Van den Enden had a very lively household. This would have been a welcoming environment for Spinoza. And he also introduced Spinoza to a circle of men who then developed a study group. So these figures in the group, some of them at least, were Lodewijk Meyer, Jair Jellis, Peter Balling, people you might recognize if you're interested in the correspondences that are still recorded. But I want to kind of draw attention to the study group because these are really important influences on Spinoza. He originally wrote the KV, the short treatise, in Latin, and then one of the members of the study group translated it to Dutch. But they discussed it, and for those familiar with the evolution of Spinoza's work, right, the KV is very broad in some of the ideas. And Spinoza clearly changes his mind. For example, there's the suggestion in the KV that there's some sort of divine teleology. Spinoza would very clearly deny this in the Ethics. But we should see the study group as helping him really sharpen and narrow his ideas. I think Jonathan Israel does a good job of drawing attention to the group as a way to kind of once and for all debunk the idea that Spinoza was working alone, or that he was kind of a lone thinker on a mountaintop somewhere, right? He was very much kind of embedded in his context and kind of moving along with the help of others. A Descartes scholar and sort of known for his teachings on his commentary on Descartes, on the principles. And then he became known as a political thinker. So his first political work, the TPT, the Tractatus Theologica Politicus, was published in 1670 and distributed. And he met a lot of controversy for that work. So between 1670 and 77, when he died, he sort of laid low. He was living in a room in The Hague with another family, and kind of, I think felt that caution was the best policy for his kind of practical affairs. For this audience interested in German philosophy, I think it's interesting to note that Spinoza was offered a chair of philosophy at Heidelberg in 1673. He turned that down, probably out of a fear that the position would compromise his freedom to philosophize the world. Right? He then died on February 21st, 1677 in The Hague. He was only 44, and he died of a respiratory illness. He also never married. Yeah, I think that's the detail I want to get into for now.
Yeah, no, I think you gave us you navigated very nicely through Spinoza's life. And now that you brought up this kind of study group, that was a perfect talking point to lead me to my third question, which is, who were Spinoza's main influences, and how do you think these influences affected Spinoza's own thought, maybe early thought or even mature thought, if you'd like?
Yeah, and I like the way you phrased it. It can be something kind of historical, right? Who was he reading? But we can read people very closely and not let them sort of penetrate into our own thinking. So the second question, I think, is more philosophical, and it's really nice. So Spinoza was reading, figures like Hobbes, Descartes, Maimonides, Heste Crescus, Francis Bacon, Machiavelli. We can see in the Political Treatise, which was his final work, his later political work. Of course, there's so much more going on in Spinoza than merely an unfolding of Cartesian principles. But I think it is useful, especially for people just approaching Spinoza's work, to see the categories he's borrowing from Descartes. So if Spinoza is a monist, right, Descartes is a substance dualist. Spinoza denies free will and mind-body interaction. He makes Descartes an explicit adversary in the preface to Ethics Book 5. As for Aristotle, I think we see a lot of Aristotelian readings of Spinoza. And I find it funny because Spinoza made quite sarcastic comments about ancient philosophers. So in letter 56, he says, quote, "To me, the authority of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates is not worth much," end quote. Because, these and other ancient philosophers basically invented a bunch of nonsensical concepts that led us astray in the history of philosophy. But even though Spinoza might sort of disavow this influence, right, doesn't mean that this wasn't at play in his thought. That would be a good example of how these two sides of the question can pull apart, right?
Great, thank you. I was wondering if you could clarify Spinoza's arguments on God and the ethics. Now, there's a reason why I'm asking this question. For me, books 1 and 2 of the ethics are super, super important. I love them. They're my favorite part of the text. I think they're the most metaphysical. And I was just wondering if you could clarify his arguments for God.
Yeah, excellent. And this is such a big question. So I'm going to focus in on one proposition, but in fact, that's not going to narrow the focus all that much because he still makes 4 arguments for God's existence in this one proposition. So we'll see kind of how far we get. But this is Ethics Book 1, P11, where he gives, arguably 3 ontological proofs, 1 cosmological proof. Although someone like Don Garrett, who has this paper, Spinoza's ontological argument with quotes around ontological, would argue that each of these 4 proofs has elements of the ontological. Brief rundown of what the ontological and the cosmological arguments are. Your audience, I'm sure, is familiar with Kant, but Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, it says that the ontological argument is an argument for God's existence from the concept of God, a necessary being. And then the cosmological argument, on the other hand, is an argument for God's existence from the existence of a contingent being. So the ontological moves from the necessary to the contingent, and the cosmological moves from the contingent to the necessary. Spinoza seems to make a cosmological argument in E1P11 insofar as he says we exist, and that should be proof that God exists. But he not only articulates what seems to be a version of the PSR, he also uses causal reasoning throughout these 4 proofs. And this seems to suggest that there might be something cosmological going on in not just this one proof in E1P11, but in all of them. And this is, take it. The cosmological argument involves the principle of sufficient reason, allegedly because the way that we move in the cosmological argument from the contingent to the necessary is that we seek a cause for the contingent. And this generates a regress because the cause of one contingent being also has a cause, which in turn has a cause. And at some point, we need to end this regress. And the way that we end it is by recourse to an infinite cause, to be God. Now, the ontological argument and the cosmological argument, seem both to involve a kind of leap. So the ontological argument involves a leap from a concept to actual existence. And this is surprisingly not at all troubling to Spinoza, right? He thinks that actual existence is contained in the concept of God. And it's hard to understand actual infinity where we're just counting 1 plus 1 plus 1, right? We get to actual infinity. Briefly, right, the ontological argument is a priori, it's prior to experience, and then the cosmological argument is a posteriori, it's coming after experience. Before I dive, and is it okay? I would like to look at the text of P11. Is that all right with you?
Absolutely. Jump right in.
Okay.
Jump right in.
So I'm going to just look at 3 definitions at the beginning of Ethics Book 1 that are going to be important for this proposition. In fact, these 6, which I'll quote, is then verbatim appears in the proposition. But Spinoza defines God at the beginning of the Ethics in these interesting kind of steps. So definition 1, the very opening of the Ethics, is the causa sui. Causa means cause, sui means self. So Spinoza opens the Ethics with, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. That whose essence is in turn going to be substance, D3. By substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself, i.e. that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. And then definition 6, Spinoza finally labels what he's already been defining as God. So he says, by God, I understand a being absolutely infinite, i.e. a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. Now, it's amazing how much of Spinoza's metaphysics is already contained in these definitions. We have these categories of substance and attributes. We have the identification of causation and conception. What we don't have yet in just these 3, although this comes up in other definitions, is the category of modes, which is this 3rd metaphysical category in addition to substance and attributes. Modes are caused and conceived through substance. They're dependent on substance. So E1P11, the proposition reads, quote, God, or a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, so we recall that from definition 6, necessarily exists. And Spinoza gives a reductio. And he says, if you deny this, conceive if you can that God does not exist. I don't know what readers like, I can't conceive that God doesn't. We're already so convinced by Spinoza we can't conceive otherwise. Okay, therefore, his essence does not involve existence. But this is absurd. Why? Because we stipulated that God's essence involves existence. Therefore, God necessarily exists, QED, as has been proven, QED. Now, it's interesting. So Spinoza will say, as has been proven, and then go immediately to another argument. Alternatively, he'll say, so on. And I was noticing this in Spinoza's arguments for the denial of free will. He gives something like a dozen arguments across his works for the denial of free will. And on the one hand, this seems, so providing all these arguments might cause us to sort of wonder why he needs them or why he's making them. And I just want to flag that for listeners. So now this first alternative argument is arguably an articulation of the principle of sufficient reason. Spinoza says, quote, for each thing there must be assigned a cause or reason, as much for its existence as for its non-existence. And then he does something really nice, which is he sort of fleshes out the reductio that he's just given above. So he says, if God does not exist, take it that God does not exist. Well, there must be a reason for God's non-existence. So let's put pressure on that point. And that reason for God's non-existence would either have to be outside of God or in God, an external cause or an internal cause. And it's interesting because saying, all right, well, God needs to be caused by something somewhere. Where's the cause coming from? Okay, if it's outside of God, then we get here to what Spinoza says about the causal barrier of the attributes, that for a cause to make an effect, it needs to have something in common with its effect, i.e. they need to share the same nature. So modes have to share the same attribute in order to have a causal connection. A mode of thought can cause another mode of thought, but it can't cause a mode of extension. And this is important for Spinoza. So he's going to sort of apply this to substance and say, well, if the cause of the substance's non-existence is coming from outside of itself, then it has to be coming from a substance that shares its nature. But the nature of substance is to exist. So if these two substances share a nature, then they both exist. Okay, so that's ruled out. And then if the cause of God, or if the substance that's supposed to cause God's non-existence doesn't share the same nature with the substance that it's causing not to exist, then it can't have a causal connection. And that's also ruled out. So there's no causal connection, and there's no causing it not to exist. So this is the external cause ruled out. Internal cause, if the cause of God's non-existence, so this substance's non-existence, is within God, then God's nature involves a contradiction, i.e. both existing and not existing. And this is absurd. Okay, the reductio is done. This is absurd. The second alternative now is, to me, looking like a cosmological argument, and it involves power. Spinoza says to be able not to exist is to lack power. To be able to exist is to have power. And the phrasing here is interesting because post-aging to be able to not exist. So there's a kind of something, there's an ability or a kind of power to not existing, but in fact, that's lacking power. So if we take away God, say God doesn't exist, and then we only have finite beings, then finite beings are more powerful than God because finite beings are able to exist, God's able not to exist. But this is absurd, Spinoza says, because the finite is not more powerful than the infinite. So either nothing exists, no finite beings, or God exists. And then he says, but we exist. So this is the kind of a posteriori move. Therefore, God exists. And then finally, he runs this fourth proof that's similar to the third, but using the concepts of reality and perfection. As I said, so existence and power are just reality and perfection. And there's a kind of chain of equivalences, which we'll see throughout the ethics, right? So Spinoza will draw an equivalence between virtue and goodness and excellence and power and so on. And there's sort of the chain just increases and extends as the ethics goes on. But this would be an example of that. So power is then reality and perfection. God's idea excludes all imperfection, perfection and self-existence, right? And that's also very classic Anselm ontological proof. Recall Anselm says that God is a being that which greater cannot be conceived, right? I mean, that's just sort of assigning God all these superlatives, and then saying, well, existence is part and parcel.
Well, I can't tell you how thankful I am that you went right through that entire argument. That was fantastic, actually. So the viewers are going to have a treat there. That was great, and I really appreciate all the hard work you put into preparing for that answer. So the next question is a little, maybe it's a little more personal, because I heard you on a podcast, and I thought your answers were fantastic, and I thought you were really enthusiastic and articulate. So your dissertation is on both Hobbes and Spinoza. And what similarities do you see in both thinkers' political philosophy? So we're taking a little bit of a move away from, the ethics into other texts, but I thought this would be interesting. It could highlight some of your work, and also we could get into more of Spinoza's philosophy.
Yeah, so actually this is out of my wheelhouse because I don't work on the politics in Spinoza or Hobbes. But this is important because there is a lot to say about the connection between their work in politics. And Sandra Field, for example, is a really excellent scholar working on that. All I will say is that, like Hobbes, Spinoza puts an emphasis on harmony and kind of keeping the peace. So, for example, in the Political Treatise 5, 2, he says, therefore, that state is best where men pass their lives harmoniously and where the laws are kept without violation. For certainly we should impute rebellions, wars, and contempt for or violation of laws, not so much to the wickedness of the subjects as to the corruption of the state. Men aren't born civil, they become civil. And then in the next paragraph, he starts to talk about the state of nature, and we should absolutely hear Hobbes there. That's a great line. Men aren't born civil, they become civil. So Spinoza will think that democracy is the best form of government to keep the peace. And, arguably that's not where Hobbes lands. He seems to be more of a monarchist.
Well, thank you for that. And we move on to a bigger question. How does Spinoza view the human subject? And what do you think is the purpose of life and for human subjects in Spinoza's philosophy?
Yeah, these are two big and difficult questions. I mean, I mentioned earlier that a mode is Spinoza's metaphysical category, which includes finite things. A mode subjectivity is its striving for self-preservation, or its conatus, a Latin word meaning endeavor. And so the conatus is important for Hobbes' thought as well. And he has two different conceptions of it, but the moral psychological one I think is useful here, where Hobbes talks about the bodily movement and appetite for pleasure and aversion. So we share this kind of essence, the striving for self-preservation with all finite things. So there's nothing special about that. And I think he kind of moves away from an anthropomorphic conception of human life, which is again why he's so interesting, I think, to feminists, right? I mean, rightly so. But according to Ethics 3P12, humans strive not only to preserve themselves, but to increase their power. And I think that touches on subjectivity in an interesting way. So Spinoza says in that proposition that for ideas of the imagination, humans will strive to sort of think empowering thoughts. And I read this as sort of excluding thoughts that threaten our psychological integrity. So we shouldn't immediately see that as a crude form of egoism in terms of how we exist in the world. But in terms of how we conceive ourselves and our own psychological process, in which we can be quite self-protective in our thinking. So we might inflate the space we take up in other people's minds, thinking that we're sort of more important to other people than we are, that we're in fact, right, the center of the universe. Though his metaphysics would deny that, right? He's attuned to it. And I think there's a kind of self-preservation in that move, right? In that kind of egoism. Alex Douglas has a nice recent book, The Philosophy of Hope, Beatitude in Spinoza. And there's an interesting kind of conception of blessedness as this increasingly expansive self-definition. But we might see the striving to increase our power as being a kind of restricted self-definition, in that it involves our finite time and place becoming inflated in some way. So what is the purpose of life for human subjects? I mean, this is, right, such a big and wonderful question, really. I think, Spinoza denies teleology. It might reappear, though, in some sense in Book 5. So the purpose of life might be to know God. And I certainly, I would like it to be, because it's a lovely thought. And one reason to think that this might be a possible reading of Spinoza is that Spinoza talks about blessedness, or knowing God, in terms of excellence, virtue, and perfection. So E5, P13S, Spinoza says, therefore, the more each of us is able to achieve in this kind of knowledge, the more he is conscious of himself and God, i.e., the more perfect and blessed he is. And perfection does seem to imply a kind of end, right? A kind of purpose.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I mean, I'm like stuck in my head right now because you're giving me all these great, rich answers, and I have even more questions, but I'll stick with the questions I sent you. So, what are some of the most important features of Spinoza's philosophy that you think highlight him as an integral philosopher in the history of philosophy?
Yeah. You mentioned the negative and the positive in Spinoza's reception and introduction. And I think Spinoza's metaphysics is a kind of metaphysics of like pure positivity, in the sense that everything that is necessarily, God is all powerful. There's perhaps no negation in the end. I mean, it remains to be seen. So he's certainly a philosopher of positive assertions, but I think that his negative contribution is really important as well. The kind of negative contribution that then clears the ground for his own metaphysics. But his denial of teleology is an extremely interesting philosophical contribution, and one that if anything, warrants as much study as the more positive side.
By positive and negative, I meant that he was often written, or Spinozism was often written off due to Jacobi calling all speculative philosophy as Spinozism, and of course the whole controversy with Lessing, and whether Lessing was a Spinozist, and Mendelssohn getting involved. But I mean, the German idealists like Hegel and Schelling found freedom in Spinoza. Like Schelling writes this beautiful letter in 95 to Hegel, where he says, I have a new teacher, like my teacher is Spinoza. And he writes the ethics side by side with his 1801 presentation of my system of philosophy. And he writes it in the geometrical method, just like Spinoza. And I think he's very, very inspired by Spinoza. And this is why I think Spinoza is so important, not just because I'm a Schellingian, but because I think Spinoza is important to all of these thinkers from this tradition, from Lessing all the way to Hegel, and even up into Schopenhauer and other thinkers. I want to thank you so much for navigating us through all of these difficult questions. You did such a great job. You were so articulate, very, very clear, and I think anyone watching this would be able to follow you. So thank you so much for being here and telling us about your research, and your scholarship. And I guess just before we go off, I was wondering, are you working on any other projects right now? Are you working on articles? Where can the viewers get more work by you?
Yeah, so I'm polishing up an article on the role of experience in Spinoza's denial of free will, where I look quite closely at ethics 2, proposition 49s, and the number of examples that Spinoza gives to try to plausibilize the denial of free will over and against the kind of imagined, Cartesian opponent who's saying, well, it's intuitive that we have free will from experience. We can see that. Additionally, I'm co-authoring with Kate Ewan an article on citation practices in cases of sexual misconduct in academia.
Okay.
And so hopefully that will be forthcoming soon.
All right, and I will find all the links, and I'll post them all when get them from you and post them in the video so people can check out more of your work. So thank you so much
Cool.
for being here.